January 1946. A small farming town in rural Iowa. Snow fell quietly over the converted barracks that had once held enemy soldiers. Inside a modest Presbyterian church hall, a young German woman named Hildegard Schneider sat across from Captain Robert Hayes of the U.S. Army Education Division. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of coffee. Real coffee. Not the ersatz grain substitute she'd known for years. The captain slid a folder across the table. Inside were lesson plans, grammar charts, and a request that seemed impossible. Would she teach German language classes to American officers who would soon oversee the occupation? Would she help train the men who had defeated her homeland? Hildegard stared at the papers, then at the captain's face. He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't demanding. He was asking. For the first time in years, someone in uniform was asking her opinion, seeking her expertise, treating her not as an enemy, but as a professional. She looked down at her coffee cup, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. The America she had been taught to fear, the America of Allied propaganda and Nazi warnings, did not match the patient man sitting across from her, waiting for her answer. This moment, repeated in dozens of towns across America between 1945 and 1947, revealed something extraordinary. The United States, having defeated Nazi Germany with overwhelming force, now turned to the wives, sisters, and daughters of former enemies and asked them to teach, not to serve in humiliation, but to educate. The transformation that occurred in church halls, community centers, and converted military facilities across the American heartland represented more than language instruction. It became an ideological earthquake, shattering carefully constructed beliefs about democracy, freedom, and the nature of victory itself. The story begins not in 1946, but in 1943, when the first German prisoners of war began arriving on American soil in significant numbers. Following the North African campaigns and the fall of Tunisia, over 370,000 German POWs would eventually be transported across the Atlantic to camps scattered throughout the United States. They arrived expecting concentration camps, starvation, and the brutal treatment Nazi propaganda had promised them. What they found instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives, not through trauma, but through cognitive dissonance. The camps themselves violated every expectation. Established under the Geneva Convention protocols that the United States took seriously even as Germany ignored them, the POW facilities provided 2,800 calories per day when American civilians received 2,000. The prisoners received medical care equal to American soldiers. They were paid for their labor. 80 cents per day in scrip they could use in camp canteens stocked with cigarettes, candy, beer, and magazines. They played soccer on maintained fields. They formed orchestras and theater companies. They received mail and packages from home. Some camps even had swimming pools. German soldier Hans Werner Richter, captured in North Africa and sent to a camp in Oklahoma, wrote in his secret diary, "We are living better than we ever did in the Wehrmacht, better than we lived before the war." The abundance here is pornographic. It offends our suffering. He used that word deliberately, pornographic. The excess felt obscene to men who had been taught that scarcity built character, that discipline required deprivation. American plenty seemed morally wrong, but the real transformation began not in the camps themselves, but in the communities surrounding them. As the war effort intensified, American agriculture faced a critical labor shortage. Millions of young men had joined the military. The government initiated a program allowing POWs to work on farms, in canneries, and in food processing plants under supervision. This meant contact, daily, extended contact, between enemy soldiers and American civilians, and here, the program encountered an unexpected problem. Many German POWs spoke limited or no English. American farmers needed to communicate work instructions. Military supervisors needed to explain safety protocols. The solution seemed obvious. Find German speakers to serve as interpreters and, more ambitiously, to teach basic German to American personnel who would eventually occupy Germany. The U.S. Army's Special Services Division began identifying potential instructors. They needed native speakers, preferably educated, preferably without Nazi affiliations. They needed people who could be trusted, and they found them in an unexpected population. German immigrant women and the wives of German immigrants who had lived in America for years, sometimes decades. These women existed in a peculiar limbo. Many had come to America in the 1920s and 1930s, fleeing economic collapse or seeking opportunity. They had married, raised children, learned English, and built lives. Then the war came, and suddenly their accents marked them as suspect. Their relatives remained in Germany under bombs dropped by their adopted country. Their sons sometimes served in the American military, while their cousins fought for the Wehrmacht. They learned to speak quietly in public, to avoid their native language, to make themselves invisible. Now, the U.S. government was asking them to become visible again, to use the language they had hidden, to interact with young men who might have fought alongside their brothers or cousins, to serve as a bridge between two worlds that had tried to destroy each other. The first women who agreed did so cautiously, often with deep ambivalence. Margaret Hoffman, a 43-year-old housewife from Michigan who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1927, later recalled, "When they asked me, I thought it was a test. I thought they wanted to see if I was loyal to Germany or to America. I didn't understand that they genuinely needed my help. That concept, that the U.S. government needed something from me and would ask politely, it was foreign to everything I knew about governments." The teaching arrangements varied by location and need. Some women taught in formal classroom settings at nearby military bases, instructing officers preparing for occupation duty. Others worked directly in POW camps, teaching conversational German to guards and administrators. Still others served as interpreters during prisoner work details, facilitating communication between POWs and American farmers. What none of them expected was the reaction from the prisoners themselves. The POWs had been prepared for many things. They had been trained to resist interrogation, to maintain military discipline even in captivity, to await liberation or repatriation. They had been warned about American interrogation techniques, about attempts to break their spirit, about the cruelty of democratic capitalism. What they had not been prepared for was kindness, professional courtesy, respect. When Hildegard Schneider taught her first class to a group of POWs, a special advanced German literature course for prisoners with higher education, she walked into the room expecting hostility. She was a German woman working for the American military, teaching German soldiers who might view her as a traitor. She wore her best dress and carried her old university textbooks, armor against anticipated contempt. Instead, the men stood when she entered. They addressed her as Frau Professor, even though she had never finished her degree. When she began discussing Goethe's Faust, several prisoners wept openly, not from sadness, but from the profound disorientation of sitting in an American POW camp, discussing the heights of German culture, treated as students rather than enemies. After class, a young prisoner named Ernst approached her. He had been a teacher before the war. "Frau Professor," he said quietly, "I don't understand this place." In Germany, we learned that America had no culture, only money, that democracy made people weak and stupid. But you left Germany for America, and you still know Goethe. You still speak proper German. You're not weak. Nothing here makes sense anymore. This conversation repeated, in various forms, in dozens of locations. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for many prisoners. They had been taught that women in democracies were frivolous, that American society degraded feminine virtue, that freedom meant moral chaos. Yet here were German women, educated, dignified, often remarkably competent, who had chosen to live in America and who defended that choice not through propaganda, but through their evident well-being. Anna Weiss, a 38-year-old instructor from Minnesota who taught German at a camp near Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, kept detailed notes about her students' questions. The POWs asked her constantly about life in America. How much could she speak freely? Could she criticize the government? Did she fear the police? Could she travel without papers? Could she own property? Vote? When she answered yes to nearly everything, they assumed she was lying or had been coerced into lying. So she brought proof. She brought her property deed, her voter registration card, newspapers with editorials criticizing President Roosevelt and later President Truman, published openly without censorship. She brought her husband, a factory worker, who explained his union membership and how he had participated in a strike in 1941 without being arrested or shot. She brought her teenage daughter, who talked about choosing her own education and career plans. The prisoners examined these artifacts like archaeologists studying an alien civilization, a society where ordinary people owned land, criticized leaders, joined unions, and made autonomous choices contradicted everything they had been taught about democracy's failures. The presence of German women living freely and prosperously in this system made the contradiction impossible to ignore. Werner Burkhardt, a former Hitler Youth leader captured at Normandy and sent to a camp in Kansas, later wrote about his instructor, Frau Elisabeth Koch. She destroyed my worldview more effectively than any bomb. She was everything we were told German women should be: educated, culturally knowledgeable, devoted to family. But she had achieved this in America, not despite America. She told us she had more freedom to be truly German in Kansas than she ever had in Munich under the Nazis. I wanted to dismiss her as corrupted by American materialism, but she spoke better German than I did. She knew more about German philosophy and literature than my Hitler Youth leaders. How could the inferior democracy produce superior Germans? The symbolic object that haunted these interactions, mentioned again and again in letters and memoirs, was food. The abundance of American food became an ideological weapon more powerful than any propaganda. The women who taught German classes often brought cookies, cake, or sandwiches to share, casual gestures of hospitality that carried enormous weight. Hildegard Schneider remembered bringing Christmas cookies to her advanced literature class in December 1945. They were simple butter cookies, the kind her mother had made in Germany before the war. She had baked them with real butter, real sugar, real flour, ingredients that were still rationed in America, but available. She offered them casually, the way a teacher might share snacks with students. The prisoners stared at the cookies as if they were hallucinations. One man picked up a cookie and held it carefully, examining it. "My mother used to make these," he said. "Before the war. Before the rationing. Before—" He didn't finish. He ate the cookie slowly, his eyes closed. Later, Hildegard found him crying in the hallway. "My family is starving in Hamburg," he told her. "I am eating butter cookies in Iowa. How am I supposed to understand the world anymore?" This was the recurring pattern. Every gesture of normalcy, every display of abundance, every moment of respect chipped away at the ideological foundations the prisoners had built their identities upon. The German women who taught them became unwitting agents of transformation, not through political arguments but through existence itself. The American military certainly understood the propaganda value of the POW program. The Special Projects Division deliberately documented camp conditions, filmed the educational programs, and collected prisoner testimonials. They knew that German POWs would eventually return home and tell stories about their captivity. They wanted those stories to reflect well on American democracy, But the women who taught German occupied a different space. They were not official propagandists. They were civilians with complicated histories, teaching language and sometimes inadvertently teaching ideology through their mere presence. Their effectiveness came precisely from their authenticity. They were not performing democracy for an audience, but living it, flaws and all. Margareta Hoffman taught conversational German to American officers at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. Her students were preparing for occupation duty in Germany. They needed to learn not just vocabulary, but cultural context. How to interact with German civilians, how to understand German institutions, how to recognize the difference between committed Nazis and ordinary people caught in history's machinery. Margaret found herself becoming a cultural translator in unexpected ways. She explained to her American students that not every German had supported Hitler, that many had been afraid, that the dictatorship had developed gradually and then suddenly. She also found herself defending America to skeptical officers who wondered if democracy could really be taught to a defeated enemy. "Can you teach people to be free?" one lieutenant asked her. "You don't teach freedom," Margaret replied. "You demonstrate it. You let people experience making choices and living with consequences. You show them that ordinary people can disagree without violence. That's what America gave me. Not perfection. God knows this country has problems, but the chance to speak, to choose, to build a life. That's what Germans need to see." The lieutenant included her words in his report. They eventually reached policymakers designing the occupation strategy. The idea that democracy spreads through demonstration rather than instruction influenced decisions about how America would govern post-war Germany. Meanwhile, in the POW camps, subtle transformations accumulated. Prisoners who attended German classes taught by immigrant women began asking for books beyond the military-approved materials. They requested German newspapers published in America, German-language papers that included uncensored news and open criticism of both American and German policies. They wanted to read German-language literature that had been banned under the Nazis. The instructors became librarians, smuggling banned books into camp classrooms. Anna Weiss brought her personal copy of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, forbidden in Nazi Germany because Mann had opposed Hitler and fled to America. She read passages aloud to her advanced students, watching their faces transform as they encountered German prose of stunning beauty written by an exile who had chosen freedom over homeland. "Mann left Germany," one prisoner said. "He betrayed the fatherland." "He left a dictatorship," Anna replied. "He remained German. I remained German. You can be German and oppose Nazis. Those are not the same thing." This distinction, German versus Nazi, became central to many discussions. The women instructors, having lived outside Nazi control, could articulate a version of German identity not defined by the Third Reich. They offered prisoners a way to remain culturally German while rejecting Nazi ideology, a psychological exit ramp many desperately needed. The emotional impact on the instructors themselves varied widely. Some found the work rewarding, even healing. Teaching their native language after years of hiding it allowed them to reclaim a part of themselves they had suppressed. Others found it traumatic, confronting young men who might have killed their relatives or destroyed their childhood homes. Elizabeth Koch, who taught at the Kansas camp, had lost her brother in the Allied bombing of Dresden. When she learned that one of her students had served in the Luftwaffe and participated in early war bombing raids, she initially refused to teach him. But the camp commander asked her to reconsider, and she agreed to meet with the young man privately. His name was Dieter Schultz, and he was 23 years old. When Elizabeth confronted him about his service, he didn't defend himself. "I know what we did," he said. "I know about Dresden, too. I know my bombs killed people's brothers. I don't have words to make that right." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Elizabeth said, "I can't forgive you. That's not mine to give. But I can teach you German grammar. Maybe that's enough for today." They continued classes together. They never became friends. But something passed between them that transcended personal forgiveness, a mutual recognition of shared humanity despite irreparable harm. Elizabeth later wrote, "Teaching Dieter didn't heal my grief, but it reminded me that every soldier who died was someone's brother. Every pilot who dropped bombs was someone's son. That doesn't excuse anything, but it complicates revenge." This complication, the painful complexity of seeing enemies as individual humans, characterized many instructor-prisoner relationships. The women found themselves inadvertently humanizing men they had every reason to hate, while simultaneously helping those men recognize that the people they had been taught to dehumanize were, in fact, fully human. The teaching program also exposed the prisoners to American gender dynamics that contradicted Nazi propaganda. The instructors were often educated women with professional competence and personal authority. They gave instructions to American military officers who listened respectfully. They made decisions about curriculum without requiring male approval. They drove cars, owned property, managed money, and expressed political opinions. For many young German prisoners raised under Nazi ideology that relegated women to children, church, and kitchen, this was profoundly disorienting. The instructors were not mannish or unfeminine. They were often married with children. They dressed modestly. They maintained traditional social courtesies. But they also possessed agency and authority that Nazi ideology claimed would destroy feminine virtue. Hans Werner Richter, the POW who had initially found American abundance pornographic, wrote extensively about his instructor, Frau Greta Zimmermann. She was a 52-year-old grandmother who had emigrated from Stuttgart in 1923. She taught advanced German and European history at a camp in Texas. Frau Zimmermann confused everything I thought I knew about women and freedom, Richter wrote. She was a grandmother who baked excellent strudel and also had strong opinions about Bismarck's foreign policy. She deferred to her husband in personal matters but overruled American military officers on educational questions. She was simultaneously traditional and liberated, feminine and authoritative. The Nazi ideology couldn't account for her. She was living proof that freedom doesn't destroy feminine virtue. It allows women to be fully human. These observations appear repeatedly in prisoner writings. The women instructors embodied a version of womanhood that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible. Educated, assertive, family-oriented, culturally engaged, and personally autonomous all at once. Their existence demonstrated that the Nazi claims about democracy degrading women were simply false. By 1946, as the war ended and repatriation planning began, the teaching program expanded. The U.S. government launched a formal re-education initiative for German POWs, teaching democratic principles alongside practical skills. The German women instructors played central roles, now teaching not just language but civics, explaining how American democracy functioned in practice. Hildegard Schneider found herself teaching a course titled Democratic Institutions to a group of former Wehrmacht officers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A German immigrant teaching German officers about democracy, while Germany itself lay in ruins. But Hildegard approached it with unexpected passion. She didn't romanticize America. She taught about the internment of Japanese Americans, about racial segregation, about labor disputes and political corruption. Democracy isn't perfect, she told her students. It's just better. It allows people to see problems and work to fix them. It allows you to criticize the government without being shot. That's the difference. Not perfection. Process. The officers pushed back. How could America criticize Germany's treatment of Jews while maintaining racial segregation? How could democracy claim moral superiority while interning its own citizens based on ancestry? Hildegard didn't defend the indefensible. You're right, she said. America has profound moral failures. The difference is that Americans can say that. I can stand here and tell you that my adopted country is hypocritical, and tomorrow I'll still be free. In Germany, criticism meant death. That's not a small difference. That's everything. One former officer later wrote about this exchange. She gave me permission to love Germany while opposing what Germany had become. She showed me that patriotism could mean demanding your country live up to its ideals, not blindly supporting whatever it does. This concept, loyal opposition, seemed paradoxical under Nazi logic. But she lived it. She loved Germany enough to leave it when it betrayed its own best traditions. She loved America enough to criticize it when it failed its principles. That kind of loyalty was more mature than anything we'd learned about honor and duty. As repatriation approached, the emotional tenor of the classes changed. The prisoners were returning to a destroyed country, often uncertain if their families had survived. The instructors, many of whom still had relatives in Germany, felt the weight of this collective trauma. The teaching relationships, which had begun transactionally, often ended with genuine connection. Anna Weiss gave each of her students a departing gift, a small book of German poetry published in America, poems that had been banned under the Nazis. Inside each book, she wrote, "Take this home. Rebuild Germany as a place where poetry matters more than power." Several prisoners wrote to their instructors after returning to Germany. The letters, where they survive, reveal the lasting impact of these encounters. Werner Burkhardt wrote to Elizabeth Koch, "I am home in a place that no longer feels like home. Everything is broken, the buildings, the economy, the spirit. But I remember what you taught me, that being German doesn't require being Nazi, that tradition can coexist with freedom, that we can rebuild on better foundations. I'm working with a youth education program now, teaching young people who grew up under Hitler how to think critically. I'm trying to be for them what you were for me, proof that another way exists." The instructors themselves emerged changed. Many had entered the program with deep ambivalence, uncertain if they were helping or betraying, healing or collaborating. They finished with a clearer sense of purpose. They had demonstrated in the most practical way possible that democracy works not through grand gestures but through daily respect, through treating even enemies as humans capable of change. Margaret Hoffman reflected on her experience in a letter to her sister. "For years, I felt torn between two countries, two identities. Teaching German to prisoners and officers helped me understand that I don't have to choose. I can be fully German and fully American. These identities aren't contradictory. They're complementary. Germany gave me language, culture, and history. America gave me freedom, opportunity, and the right to remain German on my own terms. The prisoners needed to see that this synthesis was possible, that you don't have to abandon your culture to embrace democracy. I hope I showed them that." The long-term implications of this program extended far beyond individual transformations. Thousands of German POWs returned home carrying stories about their American captivity. They told families and friends about the abundance, the fairness, the humanity of their treatment. They described German women who had prospered in America without abandoning their cultural identity. They explained democratic principles they had learned not from propaganda, but from lived experience. These stories spread through devastated German communities. They influenced how ordinary Germans perceived the American occupation. When American forces governed Western Germany with relative fairness and restraint, Germans who had heard POW stories about America were more willing to cooperate, less convinced that Nazi predictions of brutal occupation would materialize. The German women instructors had served inadvertently as ambassadors of democratic possibility. They had shown that freedom and culture could coexist, that prosperity didn't require authoritarianism, that women could be both traditional and empowered. They had taught language, but in doing so, they had taught ideology far more effectively than any official propaganda program. The butter cookies Hildegard Schneider brought to her class in December 1945 symbolized everything the program represented. They were a gesture of hospitality from a civilian to prisoners. They were made possible by American abundance. They represented German tradition preserved in American freedom. They were given freely, without humiliation or domination. They were ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Years later, when historians examined the successful democratization of West Germany, they pointed to many factors: the Marshall Plan's economic support, the patient construction of democratic institutions, the leadership of figures like Konrad Adenauer. But they often overlooked the quiet work done in church halls and community centers across America, where German women taught language and accidentally taught democracy to young men who needed to imagine a different future. The shock those women felt when asked to teach, the shock of being invited rather than commanded, of being respected rather than exploited, of being valued for their expertise rather than defined by their ancestry, that shock revealed the profound gap between authoritarian and democratic cultures. In authoritarian systems, governments take, they command, they extract. In healthy democracies, governments sometimes ask, they invite. They recognize that power ultimately rests with the people, who can choose to contribute or withhold their gifts. When Captain Robert Hayes asked Hildegard Schneider to teach German, he was exercising democratic power. Not power over her, but power shared with her. He was acknowledging that she possessed something valuable, something the United States needed, and that her willing cooperation mattered more than forced compliance. This simple act of asking, repeated across dozens of communities, demonstrated democratic principles more effectively than any lecture. The prisoners understood this. They recognized that the women teaching them had chosen to be there, had chosen to help, had chosen to bridge the gap between former enemies. This voluntary cooperation, this freely given effort to build something better from the ruins of war, modeled democracy in its most fundamental form, people with different backgrounds and perspectives choosing to work together for common goals. The snow fell that January day in 1946, soft and persistent, covering the barracks and the church hall and the small town in equal measure. Hildegard Schneider accepted the folder of lesson plans from Captain Hayes. She accepted the role he offered. She accepted the strange, uncomfortable, transformative work of teaching her native language to prisoners and liberators alike. She could not have known then what seeds she was planting. She could not have foreseen how her students would carry home new ideas about freedom and dignity, how they would rebuild a shattered nation with memories of her classroom challenging their every assumption. She knew only that she had been asked, not commanded, invited, not coerced, respected, not exploited. And in accepting, she demonstrated what she would later teach: that democracy lives not in grand speeches or stirring anthems, but in the daily choice to treat others with dignity, to ask rather than command, to build bridges rather than walls. The cookies she would bake for her students, the poems she would teach, the patience she would show to young men struggling to reconstruct their understanding of the world. These small acts accumulated into something larger than any of them could have imagined. Freedom, she would learn, is not a condition imposed from above. It is a practice, repeated daily, in 1,000 small choices to respect human agency and dignity. She taught German grammar and vocabulary, but her students learned something more fundamental: that they were human beings worthy of respect, capable of change, invited to participate in building a better world. That invitation, extended across battle lines and through the rubble of a shattered world, carried the seeds of reconstruction, not just of Germany, but of human possibility itself. The shock of being asked, the profound disorientation of encountering power that requests, rather than commands, that shock opened minds sealed by years of propaganda. It created space for transformation. The prisoners went home carrying that shock like a wound that heals into wisdom. The instructors went forward carrying the knowledge that their language, their culture, their very existence had become a bridge across an abyss. And America, imperfect and contradictory and abundant and free, demonstrated through these ordinary interactions the revolutionary power of treating enemies as humans capable of becoming partners in peace. The butter cookies were real. The coffee was real. The respect was real. And in their reality, these simple things became more powerful than tanks, more transformative than bombs, more lasting than victory. They became the foundation of a peace built not on dominance, but on demonstrated dignity, not on conquest, but on invitation, not on fear, but on the radical possibility that even enemies might choose, when asked freely, to build something better together.